Something is about to happen, and this time, it's not just another headline. In just a few hours, a deadline set by Donald Trump could push an already fragile situation over the edge. Behind closed doors, officials are watching the clock tick toward a moment that could trigger a wider conflict. Publicly, the warning was blunt. If Iran refuses to comply, entire parts of its infrastructure could be wiped out. And in another statement that stunned observers, he suggested that an entire civilization could be at risk if demands are ignored. This isn't happening in isolation. Iran has already rejected key conditions. Military pressure is building, and global markets are reacting in real time. Here's what makes this different and why you should pay attention. Because this isn't the first time he's said something like this. In fact, over the past 24 hours, a series of statements, moments, and decisions have started to form a pattern that some say signals escalation. Now, while others are asking a more uncomfortable question. Is this all part of a strategy or something slipping out of control? This is where everything starts to shift, from words to action. Because while the headlines were still catching up to Trump's latest warnings, events on the ground were already moving faster. Reports confirmed that U.S. forces had carried out strikes on targets linked to Iran, including strategic locations tied to energy and military infrastructure. This wasn't a symbolic move. It was a signal. And if you go back just hours earlier, Trump had already laid it out in his own words, threatening to destroy power facilities, bridges, and critical systems if Iran refused to comply. At the time, some dismissed it as rhetoric. But now, the line between threat and reality is starting to blur. I think this is the moment people begin to realize something important. Escalation doesn't always announce itself clearly. Sometimes it happens in layers. First the warning, then the pressure, and then, before anyone fully processes it, the first strike. Iran, for its part, isn't backing down. Officials have rejected immediate concessions and are signaling that any negotiation would require major conditions, including a halt to attacks. That response alone changes the equation, because now both sides are locked into positions that are harder to walk away from. And here's the part that should make you pause. This isn't just about one strike or one decision. It's about momentum. Once actions replace words, every move carries more weight, more risk, and fewer options to de-escalate. What we're seeing right now isn't just tension. It's a situation that's actively evolving, and the next move from either side could determine whether this stays contained or spirals into something far bigger than anyone expected. While military tensions escalate overseas, another wave of impact is already spreading, this time hitting far beyond the battlefield. Global markets have begun reacting, and not subtly. Oil prices have surged past $110 a barrel, a level that immediately signals stress across the global economy. Investors are pulling back, volatility is rising, and energy markets are entering a phase of uncertainty that could ripple into every major sector. At the center of it all lies a single geographic choke point, the Strait of Hormuz. Roughly 20% of the world's oil supply moves through that narrow passage. Any disruption, whether from direct conflict, blockade, or even perceived risk, can send shockwaves across global supply chains. And with tensions between the United States and Iran intensifying, that risk is no longer theoretical. This is where the consequences begin to feel real. Higher oil prices don't stay in trading charts. They move quickly into daily life. Fuel costs increase. Transportation becomes more expensive. And within weeks, if not days, those increases start showing up in groceries, utilities, and basic goods. The chain reaction is fast and difficult to reverse. In fact, early data already suggests the pressure is building. American households have been facing rising energy costs, with reports indicating increases in gas and electricity. Some estimates point to an average burden of around $1,700 per family, with total economic impact reaching into the hundreds of billions. And this is happening before any full-scale disruption, because markets don't wait for outcomes, they react to expectations. The mere possibility of escalation is enough to trigger defensive behavior, stock sell-offs, commodity spikes, and tightening financial conditions. In other words, the economic consequences begin long before any official declaration of a larger conflict. What makes this moment especially volatile is the convergence of factors. Military action is no longer hypothetical. Diplomatic channels appear strained, and global systems, energy, trade, finance are all interconnected in ways that amplify even small disruptions. So while the focus may be on missiles, strikes, and political statements, another reality is unfolding in parallel. A quieter but equally powerful shift, one that directly affects millions of people who may never see a battlefield, but will feel every consequence of what happens next. And as pressure builds on all fronts, one question becomes harder to ignore. If the situation continues to escalate, how far will the economic fallout spread? And how quickly will it reach everyone else? And then, in the middle of all this rising tension, missiles, markets, deadlines, something happened that felt completely out of place. At the White House, during what was supposed to be a light, carefully staged Easter event for children, Donald Trump stepped in front of families, cameras, and a group of kids sitting just feet away from him. The setting was simple: colorful decorations, laughter, a moment designed to project normalcy. But what followed quickly shifted the tone. Instead of staying within the spirit of the event, he began talking about something entirely unrelated. He brought up Joe Biden, and more specifically, something called an auto pen, suggesting that Biden had used a machine to sign documents instead of doing it himself. The explanation went on and on, drifting further from anything the children or even the audience expected to hear in that moment. And this is where it becomes difficult to ignore. Because if you're watching this unfold, you're not just seeing a political jab. You're seeing a disconnect between the setting and the message. This wasn't a rally. This wasn't a press conference. This was an event for kids. And yet, the conversation shifted into something that felt out of sync with everything around it. Now, let's turn to the media. Who here likes fake news? Exactly, no one. We must demand accountability from our sources. This is crucial for informed discourse. To that kind of exchange. The energy became uneven, the tone uncertain, and for a moment, it wasn't clear who the message was even meant for. From a distance, it might seem like just another off-script moment, but placed within the broader timeline, the escalating threats, the military actions, the academic reactions, it starts to carry a different weight. I think this is where people begin to notice a pattern, even if they can't fully explain it yet. Because you don't just look at one moment like this in isolation. You connect it to everything else happening at the same time. You see the warnings to Iran. You see the strikes. You see the markets reacting. And then you see this, a moment that feels disconnected from all of it, yet happening right in the middle of it. And if you're being honest with yourself, you probably start asking the same question others are beginning to ask. How do these moments fit together? Is this simply a leader speaking off the cuff, shifting between topics without a script? Or is it something else? Something that becomes more concerning when viewed alongside decisions that carry real-world consequences? Because here's the reality. When tension is this high, every public appearance matters. Every word is analyzed. Every signal, intentional or not, can influence how allies, opponents, and even markets interpret what comes next. And yet, in that moment, standing in front of children, talking about auto-opens and media narratives, none of those larger stakes seem to be reflected in the message. That contrast, that gap between what's happening globally and what's being said publicly is what makes this moment stand out. And maybe that's why it's getting so much attention. Because when events on the world stage are escalating this quickly, people aren't just watching what decisions are being made. They're watching how those decisions are being communicated. And right now, those two things don't seem to be fully aligned. And then came a moment that, on the surface, sounded simple, but quickly turned into one of the most talked about clips. During that same stretch of appearances, Donald Trump asked a question that immediately left people confused. How did I do with the voters that do eggs? First, there was a pause, then laughter, then visible uncertainty. Because no one, reporters, attendees, or even supporters nearby, seemed entirely sure what that meant. Was he referring to farmers? The egg industry? A metaphor? Or was it something else entirely? He didn't clarify. Instead, he doubled down. He followed up by asking whether people in the egg industry, they voted for Kamala Harris, calling her low IQ, and then pivoted again, comparing her to Biden, asking who was lower. The exchange became increasingly fragmented, jumping from one idea to another without a clear connection. And this is where the moment starts to stand out. Because if you're watching this, you're not just hearing, You're trying to follow the logic of a political attack. You're trying to understand where the sentence started and where it was supposed to go, but the structure isn't there. The transitions don't land, and the audience is left filling in the gaps. From his perspective, it may have felt like a normal back and forth, an attempt to engage the crowd. That's how these moments often play out. Fast, unscripted, reactive. But from the outside, especially in a moment like this, it feels different. I find this is where attention shifts. Not because of what was said, but because of how it was said. When public figures speak, especially during moments of global tension, people tend to listen more carefully. They look for clarity, direction, intent. But here, instead of a clear message, what emerged was a sequence of thoughts that didn't fully connect, and you can see it in the reactions. Some people laughed it off. Others replayed the clip trying to interpret it, and many began asking the same quiet question: was this just an awkward phrasing or something more? Because this wasn't hack happening in isolation. This came just after warnings to Iran, just as markets were reacting, just as military actions were being reported. And in that context, even a small moment like this carries more weight than it normally would. You start to notice patterns, not because someone tells you to, but because the moments begin to stack. One unclear statement might not mean much, two might still be coincidence. But when they keep happening, back to back, across different settings, different topics, you begin to pay attention differently. And maybe you felt that too. You watch one clip, then another, then another. And at some point, it stops feeling random. It starts feeling like something is off. Because communication, especially at that level, isn't just about words. It's about coherence, timing, awareness of the moment. And when those elements begin to drift even slightly, people notice. And right now, they are noticing. Because while the world is watching developments unfold on a much larger scale, conflict, economics, global stability, they're also watching these smaller moments, trying to understand what they mean in the bigger picture. And the truth is, no one has a clear answer yet. But the questions are getting louder. And then the narrative takes an even more complicated turn. Because it's not just what was said, but how often the message seemed to change. At different moments, Donald Trump appeared to be describing two completely different directions at once. In one instance, he suggested that the conflict with Iran could be nearing an end, that things were moving toward resolution. But almost in the same breath, the tone shifted dramatically, with warnings about escalating the situation, even suggesting the possibility of bombing Iran to the Stone Age. And when pressed for clarity, when asked directly which path he was actually pursuing, the response didn't resolve the contradiction. I can't tell you, I don't know. That answer, more than anything else, is what caught people's attention. Because if you're following this closely, you're not just hearing two different strategies, you're hearing uncertainty in the middle of a high-stakes situation. And that's where the tension really begins to build. From his perspective, this might be framed as flexibility, keeping options open, responding dynamically depending on what Iran does next. That's often how leaders describe shifting positions in unpredictable environments. From the outside, from where you're standing, it doesn't always come across that way. It feels like mixed signals. And in a situation like this, mixed signals don't just stay within a press conference. They travel. They get picked up by allies, interpreted by adversaries, and analyzed by markets that are already on edge. Every word becomes a signal. Every shift in tone becomes a data point. I think this is where the discomfort starts to grow. Because you're trying to understand the direction, where this is heading, what the end game looks like, but the messaging doesn't line up in a clear, consistent way. One moment suggests de-escalation. The next suggests the opposite. And when those messages exist side by side, it creates a kind of informational vacuum. People begin to fill in the gaps themselves. Some assume it's strategic ambiguity, a deliberate tactic to keep opponents uncertain. Others see it as inconsistency, a sign that there may not be a fully defined plan guiding these decisions. And the truth is, without a clear answer, both interpretations start to circulate at the same time. Meanwhile, the situation on the ground continues to evolve. Military pressure remains, diplomatic responses are limited, and the broader context, the rising oil prices, the global market reactions, the growing instability, doesn't pause while these messages are being sorted out. So now, you're looking at two layers unfolding simultaneously. On one level, there's the real-world escalation, strikes, responses, positioning. On another level, there's the communication around it, uncertain, shifting, at times contradictory. And when those two layers don't align, that's when things start to feel unpredictable. Because in moments like this, clarity isn't just helpful, it's critical. Without it, every move becomes harder to interpret. Every response becomes harder to anticipate. And the margin for miscalculation begins to shrink. And that may be the most important point here. Not just what is being said, how that message is guiding what happens next. Because if the direction isn't clear, then neither is the outcome. And that leaves everyone watching, waiting, reacting, trying to make sense of a situation that no longer seems to follow a single predictable path. And just when it seemed like the confusion was already enough, another set of statements added a completely different layer of controversy. This time, not about tone or clarity, but about facts. At one point, Donald Trump began speaking about past military operations, listing actions he claimed responsibility for. He referenced the killing of Qasem Soleimani, which is widely known and documented. But then he extended that claim further, saying he was also responsible for taking out Osama bin Laden. That's where the reaction shifted almost instantly. Because if you're watching this, you already know that the operation against bin Laden took place under a different administration. It's one of the most documented missions in recent US history. So when a statement like that is made, it doesn't just pass as a casual remark, it triggers immediate scrutiny. From his point of view, this might be framed differently. He referenced prior warnings, saying that he had called for action earlier, suggesting a kind of indirect involvement or foresight. But the way it was presented, the wording, the framing, left very little room for that nuance. And that's where things start to escalate, not on the battlefield, but in perception. I think this is the kind of moment where people stop and rewind. They don't just hear the statement once. They go back, replay it, analyze it. Because it's not just about what was said, it's about whether it aligns with what people already know to be true. And when there's a gap between those two things, it creates tension. Some supporters may interpret it as exaggeration, a rhetorical style that's been seen before. Others see it as something more concerning, especially when it's added to a growing list. The statements don't fully line up with established facts. And if you're being honest, you probably feel that tension too. Because this isn't happening in isolation. This comes after the mixed messaging about Iran, after the unclear answers about strategy, after the moments that left audiences confused. And now, statements that are being openly challenged in terms of accuracy. One moment might be dismissed. Two might still be explained away. But when they start stacking like this, it changes how people interpret each new statement that follows. And the timing makes it even more significant. Because all of this is unfolding while real-world consequences are building. Elitary pressure, economic shifts, global reactions. In that context, credibility becomes more than just a political asset. It becomes a stabilizing factor. When people trust the message, they can anticipate the next move. When they don't, uncertainty grows. And uncertainty in situations like this can spread quickly. It affects how allies respond, how adversaries calculate risk, even how markets behave. Because when the narrative becomes unpredictable, everything connected to it starts to shift as well. So now, you're not just looking at a controversial statement. You're looking at what it represents. A moment where words and widely accepted facts don't seem to align. And where that gap raises the bigger question about how information is being communicated at a time when clarity matters more than ever. And that question doesn't just stay in one moment. It carries forward into every statement that comes next. And then, just as the focus was shifting between confusing statements and escalating tensions, something else happened. Something quieter, but potentially far more serious. During a discussion about a military rescue operation, a reporter asked a direct question: how many special forces were involved? It was the kind of detail that is typically of narration handled with extreme caution. In fact, moments earlier, military officials had made it clear that this information would remain undisclosed. But then, unexpectedly, Donald Trump answered. He said it was hundreds and hundreds of troops. At first, it might not sound like much, just a number, just a rough estimate. But if you look closer, if you understand how these operations work, you begin to see why this moment stood out so sharply. Because information like that isn't usually, information should not be shared publicly, not in real time, not while operations are still being analyzed, not when revealing scale could expose tactics, capabilities, or vulnerabilities. And this is where the situation shifts again. From his perspective, it may have seemed like a way to emphasize the scale of the mission, the risk involved, the number of people who could have been in danger. That's how he framed it, highlighting the bravery, the stakes, the magnitude. But from another angle, from where analysts, military observers, and even you might be standing, it raises a different question. Should that have been said at all? I think this is where the tension becomes less visible but more serious. Because unlike a confusing sentence or a controversial claim, this isn't about interpretation. It's about protocol. It's about the boundary between what is public and what is protected for a reason. And when that boundary is crossed, even slightly, it creates headlines, it creates concern. You start to wonder how decisions about information are being made, whether there's a filter, whether there's a process, or whether, in moments like this, things are being said in real time without that layer of control. And again, this doesn't exist in isolation. This comes after shifting war messages, after disputed claims, after moments that left audiences unsure of what they were hearing. And now, a situation where potentially sensitive information is being shared openly. Each piece, on its own, might be explainable, but together, they begin to form something else. A pattern where the line between intention and consequence, it becomes harder to define. And if you're paying attention, you can feel that shift. Because now, it's not just about what is being said, it's about what that information does once it's out there. Who hears it? How it's interpreted, and what risks it might carry that aren't immediately visible. In moments of stability, that kind of detail might pass without much notice. But in a moment like this, where tensions are high, acts are unfolding, and every signal matters, it becomes something more. It becomes part of a larger question, not just about communication, but about control, and whether that control is holding or slowly starting to slip. And by this point, it becomes impossible to look at any single moment in isolation, because everything begins to connect. What started as a series of unusual statements now overlaps with real military actions, economic reactions, and growing global tension. And when those layers begin to stack, the story changes. He makes a threat. Hours later, strikes are reported. He shifts his message on war, first suggesting it could end, then escalating the language, and at the same time, markets react. Oil surges, and global systems begin adjusting in real time. Then come the moments that seem disconnected. The Easter event, the auto-open remarks, the egg voters question. On their own, each could be dismissed as off-script, unscripted, even just political style. But placed next to everything else, they start to feel different. Because now, you're not just watching isolated clips, you're watching a sequence. And in that sequence, a pattern begins to emerge. Statements that don't fully align. Messages that shift depending on the moment, claims that are questioned, information that may not have been meant for public release. And all of it happening while the stakes are getting higher, not lower. From the outside, it creates a kind of friction. On one side, there's action, real-world consequences, decisions that move markets, signals that affect international stability. On the other, there's communication that feels uneven, sometimes unclear, sometimes contradictory. And when those two don't move in sync, that's when uncertainty expands. I think this is the point where observers begin to shift how they interpret everything. Because now, each new statement isn't just heard on its own. It's compared to the last one. Each action isn't just evaluated for what it is. It's measured against the broader direction, if there is one. And this is where the real tension builds. Not from a single event, but from accumulation. You see one moment, then another, and at some point, it stops feeling like coincidence. It starts to feel like movement, like something is building, even if it's not fully defined yet. And maybe you felt that shift too, because it's no longer just about what was said at an event or what happened in a briefing. It's about how all of those moments are starting to align into a bigger picture. A picture where the lines between strategy, reaction, and unpredictability begin to blur. And that raises a question that becomes harder to ignore with every new development. Is this a controlled escalation, moving step by step toward a defined outcome? Or is it something less structured, where events are beginning to move faster than the message itself? Because if it's the second, then what we're seeing isn't just a series of headlines, it's a situation that's actively forming, one that may already be carrying consequences, far beyond what anyone initially expected. And by now, the pattern isn't subtle anymore. It's visible, and it's growing. And now, everything leads to this moment. Not a single headline, not one statement, but the weight of everything combined. Because if you've been following this closely, you've seen how it unfolds. The warnings, the strikes, the reactions, the moments that felt off. The messages that didn't quite line up. One by one, they didn't seem definitive. But together, they start to form something harder to ignore. I think this is where you have to pause. Not to jump to conclusions, and to look at the direction. Because what you're watching isn't just a series of events. It's movement, it's escalation, it's a chain reaction where each step makes the next one more unpredictable than the last. And the real question isn't just what happened. It's what happens next. You can already see the pressure building. Globally, economically, politically. You can feel how quickly things can shift when signals aren't clear. When actions move faster than explanations. When every decision carries weight far beyond the moment it's made. And maybe you're asking yourself the same thing. Many others are starting to ask, where does this lead? Because if this continues, if the pattern holds, then the consequences won't stay contained to one region, one policy, or one headline. They expand, they ripple outward. And that's why this moment matters. Not because everything has already happened, but because it might just be the beginning. So now it comes down to you, watching, thinking, connecting the dots. Do you see this as just another cycle of headlines? Or are we already standing at the edge of something much bigger?